The Bremen docker wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a sip of ersatz coffee, hoping to wash away the dust in his mouth. He felt he deserved a little rest. Having spent all day unloading neutral Swedish and Norwegian ships that had slipped south along the Danish coast and managed to get past the British blockade line, the man was tired to death, especially since he was well past 50. But what to do? The young went to the front, to a war that was already 6 weeks old. And all because of the English. Docker spat. Somewhere far away on the plains of Poland, the heel-clicking emissaries of the Wehrmacht were offering the fruits of victory to dignitaries. In Cologne, police were cleaning up leaflets scattered by Chamberlain's Air Force. And in London, as Docker read, the population was gripped by general panic and fleeing the big cities. The latter information puzzled him somewhat. He had already had experience with the British during the First World War. Stories that they were busy sticking pieces of brown paper over cracks in windows and doors, or buying rolls of black cloth for blackouts, he would immediately regard as Goebbels' lies, because Docker, who had been to the Somme, could better understand people anxious to get out of the way of something as frighteningly huge as the Reichsmarshal's air armada, rather than wasting time on childish precautions. Machines, they're the ones winning wars today. And humans don't stand a chance. The last thought pleased Docker, and he took another sip. Negro Sweat was the name of the drink in the Navy, though his comrades gave it another, more apt name. Funny thing, this war at sea. The atmosphere in the harbor must have seemed quite normal to a visitor unfamiliar with the circumstances. Winches were screeching, cranes were moving, cargoes were now and then appearing over the open holds, and all the quays were busy. A less attentive observer would certainly not have wondered why all the fuss was going on only around the Scandinavian ships, nor would he have been curious as to the reason why so many other vessels were standing deserted, with no sign of life. The docks of Bremen were jammed, for a very simple reason. They were inhabited by German ships unable to go to sea and carry cargo. They were just standing around waiting for some change. And all because of the British, who were solemnly ranting about freedom at sea. It was they who stopped the movement of cargo from Bergen to the English Channel and locked Germany's front door tight. They made the people tighten their belts. And though Docker had often said that not all of them were bastards, now he, who swallowed Negro Sweat with disgust, hoped that this time they would not go unpunished. We'll see. The Führer would teach them a good lesson. The laborer did not often approach the cargo ship named Goldenfels. It was at a berth away from his usual route, and the docker had nothing to do there. But now his feet led him to this ship, like so many others that had stood idle since September 3, and he noticed a man walking toward the gangway. Docker had seen him before. It was hard not to notice such a one, though he probably could not have explained why. There was nothing unusual about his clothes. White silk scarf, well-made suit, overcoat, the way merchant ship captains always dressed when off duty. Only the old-fashioned bowler stood out a little. And this man was of quite ordinary build. The docker had the same broad shoulders, and he was even taller than the stranger's 1 meter 90 centimeters. Perhaps, he thought, it was the voice. He had heard his voice once before, in which the Prussian detachment was softened by a unique melody. It was slow, low, and very confident. Its owner clearly knew his worth. Docker grinned. Of course, we're all gentlemen now. Everyone is his own master, even the docker. He saw the stranger approach one of the crew who had remained aboard the ship after his arrival. What a sight! To the docker's utter amazement, the other fellow stretched out, clicked his heels, and put his hand to the visor of his cap, saluting the stranger. The very real, Navy-accepted salute. This fellow must be a fool to salute like that. What's the use of a career sailor dressing up in civilian clothes if he can't refuse to show off like that? After expressing his disapproval to the culprit, Captain Zur C. Berngard Rogge, a longtime sailing expert, later captain and commander of an elite German officer-training sailing ship, was relieved when he removed the bowler and placed it on the planks on the future platform for the aft 5.9-inch gun. His fingers, nimble, strong, neatly manicured, untied the annoying and very annoying silk scarf. It was time to get to work. In the archives of the Admiralty in Berlin, marked with the mark of the highest degree of secrecy, there were records that the merchant ship Goldenfulls became a ship 16. Rogg smiled slightly. He realized it was necessary for security reasons, but he was still anxious to give the ship a name as soon as possible. A number is good for a submarine, but a surface ship has a soul. Atlantis. That was the name he had chosen for his ship. It will make his brainchild different from the oceanic Pandora's boxes filled with torpedoes, guns, and mines. There is something mysterious about it, exactly what life in the midst of the ocean is like. Rogg was pleased to have found such an apt name. He had first been offered the post of raider commander when Mr. Chamberlain returned from Munich with the promise of peace. The position seemed hypothetical at the time, as the prospect of military conflict between Germany and Great Britain seemed very remote. Well, the worst had happened, and for Rogg, war with England was indeed the worst of evils, and now he had to fulfill his duty. He was satisfied with the fact that at his post he did not have to ask every 5 minutes to ask permission to do this or that. Although the task before him was not an easy one, he often thought about it without optimism. There was so much to do, and not enough time. Rogg thought about what Cecil Rhodes would have done if he had been assigned to the first raider to leave the Reich, how he would cope with the countless obstacles encountered at every turn. He, Rogg, was tasked with attacking Britain's maritime trade routes, a task that had been carried out during World War I by such famous raiders as the Moe, Wolf, and Seidler. The preceding drama, however, was almost comic opera. It was specifically instructed that no hint of our intention to use surface raiders should leak anywhere. It was probably for this reason that a large shield was displayed on the wall of the Bremen barracks for all to see with the inscription, Armed Auxiliary Cruiser Headquarters. Life was strange after all. When he went to the department in charge of assigning officers, he was told, "What, you want 19 officers who are certain to die?" To get a conventional sextant, he had to go directly to the OCM, and he was denied a modern fire control system because, it was explained to him, there was too high a probability that the ship would sink before it could be used. And what to speak of matters of day-to-day secrecy? Well, Rogg could only be glad that his sense of humor was still with him. He only smiled, remembering the panic that had ensued when one of the loading crates had crashed and the tropical helmets had rolled down the dock. Though, of course, there was no doubt about it. The issue of secrecy was extremely important. Its main weapon is camouflage, to get out of the port, to break through the dense barrier set up by the British around the gate of Germany. The open sea, Atlantis must pretend to be something that is not really. And even after overcoming this obstacle, he had to often change guise, and every time look very convincing. Hence all sorts of stage tricks and makeup. The enemy eye must not penetrate under the false appearance of those whom the Allies would later call the Nazi trap ships, or less flattering, rattlesnakes of the oceans. Therefore, his irritation at the overzealousness of the headless petty officer who called off is well-founded. Such mistakes must not be repeated. Rogg summoned an aide. That's when I came on the scene. No one would venture to call Ship 16 beautiful. It was fairly new, but it was too wide, too squat to look graceful. As it stood at the dock, with its deck piled with crates and planks, and without any makeup, such a dirty slob didn't want to be trusted with its life at all. Looking at the mess and the piling of trash on the decks, I didn't feel a spark of the love that was so strongly rekindled later. For a moment I even regretted that I had not gone on a minesweeper, but had taken advantage of my sailor father's friendship with Rogg to end up on this pile of junk, misunderstood as an ocean raider. It cannot be said that I got the position only through patronage. Rogg wasn't that kind of captain. He saw the benefit of my knowledge of languages, my experience traveling to the States, Japan, and China. Even the fact that I had previously been a PhD did not make me at all unsuitable for the position of assistant, because his previous assistant was a brilliantly educated man, a professor of history. So the professor was recommended to Rog for shore posts, and was sent deaf and blind by the official apparatus to a minesweeper. I, on the other hand, occupied a luxurious cabin, with chintz curtains, soft carpets, a radio, and the prospect, not then suspected, of taking part in the longest voyage in history. A wolf in sheep's clothing. We were to operate on the enemy's sea communications very far from home. We were to go against England from Greenland to the Cape of Good Hope. Ship 16. Under this designation we were known in Berlin. Ship C, according to the British intelligence classification. Atlantis, one of 9 commercial raiders. Rog sat at his desk, looking thoughtfully at the globe. His left hand cupped his clean-shaven chin, his right twirled a pen. The silence, so necessary for a captain of a warship to make a fateful decision, was not yet in sight. The roar of pneumatic drills, and the clatter of hammers, as well as the shouting and cursing of the harbor workers who had begun refitting the Atlantis, but had no idea what they were doing, did not help him concentrate. For Rog, though, as he contemplated the future, all these sounds were part of the ship's symphony, which continued with the sound of the waves crashing against the hull, the shrill voices of the gulls, and the rhythmic hum of the diesel engines. Rog longed with all his heart to go to sea, but he was not so blindly impatient that he did not appreciate the assistance of the shore services, who were doing their best to send him on a combat voyage. Though, God knows, nearly 400,000 man-hours, that is, nearly 80 days' work would be enough, he thought, to equip a battleship at sea. Great are the men of the earth, but even greater are the men of the sea. Rog only sighed, recalling the words of an old Hanseatic poem. Through the half-open hatch he could hear the busy puffing of a steam locomotive on the quay, the clanking of cars on the railroad tracks, and the siren voice of a ship leaving for sea, a little sad, like a memory of love. Rog thought that everyone gathered in Bremen was forever linked to the sea and waited for its inaudible call, as ships wait for the tide to come in. The amount of work done on the Atlantis depended on when the workers would go home to their wives or girlfriends, the pay they would receive, the food and drink they could buy. In other words, by working on the ship, they would provide for themselves and their households. What's next? The ship, which they will most likely forget as soon as the work is done, remaining invisible to them, will continue to have an even greater impact. After all, the bombs whose threat to Germany would one day become a reality. Rog had no illusions about Göring's thundering promises, would depend on sea transport to deliver their components. The engines of enemy planes need constant fuel from tankers coming by sea, and the pilots will not be able to fly without getting bread, also delivered by sea. Everything that Britain can use to the detriment of Germany must first pass through the sea lanes, and Rog's task is to create the maximum number of obstacles in the way of ships with cargoes. For Atlantis, the destruction of enemy shipping is a secondary objective. Its primary objective is sporadic attacks in far-flung areas, causing rerouting and delaying transports. It should force the British Navy, already under strain, to spread itself further thin by organizing raider hunts and escorting its merchant ships. A man in work overalls peeked through the door, muttered an apology, and hurriedly retreated. A carpenter, probably, sighed Rog thought. On this ship, which conceals thousands of secrets, people get lost all the time. He could not get rid of the thought that, despite all the measures to ensure secrecy, many of the workers had long ago guessed the purpose of all the metamorphosis of the former Goldenfulls. Captain Zur C. Berngard Rog took a moment to visualize the appearance of the ship. Piles of crates with equipment and cargo, abandoned brushes smeared with lead dust, paint cans and wooden scaffolding. In general, no aesthetics. He sighed heavily again and tried to focus on his journal. He smirked, recalling Maura's remark about the ship's appearance. What had he called it? A dirtbag. A slob. Carefully and decisively, The hand with the officer's signet ring completed the day's entries with the words, "When the ship is complete, we will be proud of it. But like all women, it takes a very long time to prepare. The world is considered to be one and indivisible. The same interpretation applies to war at sea. An action in the Indian Ocean can have an impact in the North Sea or the Arctic. An attack off the coast of East Africa might divert a large force guarding the western approaches to the British Isles. For every ship sunk by a single raider within a few hours, many others would be sent on other routes or remain in harbors for weeks, and the operations of giant army formations fighting over vast areas from Libya to the Volga can be affected by the fate of a small merchant ship that the troops have never even heard of. Although most naval strategists believe that armed merchant cruisers, aka auxiliary cruisers, had outlived their usefulness, Rogge took a different view. He supported the minority who argued that the increased air threat could be countered with skillful camouflage, and that the advantages gained by the raider with diesel engines more than compensated for the increased ability of the enemy to detect ships at sea. He emphasized that while the Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse could stay at sea for less than 3 weeks during World War I, the diesel-powered Atlantis could travel 60,000 miles without additional bunkering. Therefore, Rogge argued, the modern raider was not only less constrained in his movements by considerations of where and how to obtain fuel, but could also avoid encountering tankers or coal carriers if there was a risk of destruction or capture. Although Rogge's professional credentials were alien to machine warfare, the meat grinder into which battles between German submarines and Allied convoys in the North Atlantic later became, his belief in raider warfare on enemy trade communications was based on more solid ground than conservative prejudice. The submarines of 1939 could strike at the well-protected heart of the enemy, but only we could reach the more distant and less protected arteries. In this kind of diversionary activity, the attacker has all the trump cards on his hands. It is left to him, the hunter, to choose the location and timing. He also has the distinct advantage of being certain that practically any vessel he encounters is an enemy, while the forces thrown into his destruction must find one vessel out of many, suspecting everyone. And finally, if you still don't understand why we felt so confident at the beginning of total war about the future of a merchant ship doing a maximum of 17 knots, equipped with guns still in use from World War I can quote the words of Samder. Rogge, summarizing a discussion in the wardroom about the modern equipment used by the enemy, said, "At the risk of sounding trite, gentlemen, I nevertheless wish to emphasize that the ocean is large and for a few hours out of 24 is plunged into darkness. That, Mr. Captain," I said, putting down the telephone receiver and throwing aside my pencil, was the 14th call to the higher authorities and the 3rd day of fruitless attempts to get only 4 rocket launchers from them. They don't want to understand why we need those damn rocket launchers, which are not on the list of supplied equipment, and that's the most important thing for officials. Rogge smiled. "I assume you have taken all possible actions." "Mr. Captain," I replied eagerly. "I called Berlin. I went directly to the Admiralty. I cut off the telephones of the shore command of the Baltic Fleet. I even made my way to the admiral in charge of the naval shipyards. Everywhere I turn, I'm sent to someone else. Why doesn't anyone realize we're gonna need rocket launchers for our prizes? We're probably suspected of being overly optimistic. We did get rocket launchers in the end, all 4 of them. But we had to send a report about the situation to Berlin personally to Grand Admiral Raeder, so that the coastal officials would have mercy and allocate us this extremely valuable equipment." As the days passed, the miracles taking place ashore gradually exhausted our patience. We began to realize that the much-vaunted Nazi war machine may have been effective elsewhere, but certainly not in our field of training auxiliary cruisers for war at sea. Despite the existence of a very convincing theory, the divergence of opinion between those who believed that auxiliary cruisers had a future and those who did not led to half measures in the implementation of the project. Contrary to Allied beliefs and our own expectations, in September 1939, A raider fleet existed only on paper. The strategic theory was approved and accepted for execution, and that was the end of it. Our crews spent endless weeks in idleness before the ships were even docked, and although there was a government subsidy for refitting before the war, it was only enough for some of the work, such as reinforcing the deck for mounting the guns. We barely waited for the Atlantis to be completed, which took 90 days. And this, thanks to Rogge, who had established good relations with the shipyard engineers, was a speed record. One raider was preparing to go to sea for 18 months. 500 books for the ship's library. That was the limit of my desires. 500 books. On shore, they were clearly puzzled. Books? For the library. But the crew wouldn't have time to read. Iron crosses. There was no shortage of those. Rogge flatly rejected the suggestion that he take aboard a sizable stock of these awards to distribute as needed. He objected rather coldly. Let us first go to sea and wait for the need to arise. We badly needed men who would be good companions and who could bear the hardships of a long and dangerous sea voyage. The captains of ships and clerks of admiralty conspired to send us the most notorious human material, the loss of which no one cared. People with feisty, uncooperative personalities, criminals with suspended sentences, deadbeats. I couldn't take them aboard, nor did Rogge. It took a tremendous effort on his part before we finally got a crew. On the other hand, I discovered that even preparing for a combat tour, rather than an extended cruise, has aesthetic aspects that are not mentioned in the relevant handbooks. For example, how to choose an appropriate painting to adorn a wall in the wardroom. As opinions differed on this, we, annoyed to the extreme, organized a committee to make a decision. One of the officers firmly stated, no views of German cities, no trees, meadows, or mountains. It would make us homesick. All right, I meekly agreed. Then maybe pictures of beauties. No women. The other one protested vigorously. We all know where that would lead. No, not women. Excellent, I said, when we finally agreed and chose a picture of a beautiful sailboat. Let's see what the commander has to say. And feeling proud of such a worthy choice, I went to Rogge. A crushing blow. Absolutely not. He exploded. I will not allow such an outrage on my ship. His fore and aft jib is not right. When the captain firmly rejected the idea, the committee lost interest in further argument, and the decision was entrusted to me. And I brought Mark's painting of the red horses. As for the ship, my choice was very successful and subsequently aroused much interest on the part of visitors and captured officers. In Germany, Mark's painting was considered degraded art and eventually banned. The question of decorating the sailors' quarters was not controversial. Flowers, Rogge said firmly. Flowers are the best thing for sailors. Besides, they're decidedly neutral. Well, flowers it is. We stayed at the dock for the duration of the trial. There will be no uniforms. Rogge warned us from the start. Both officers and sailors will wear civilian clothes. There will be no saluting of seniors. Although the workers must have already guessed something, it is important that they do not know the commander, the officers, and the size of the crew. I don't think we were able to deceive anyone. It is impossible to hide absolutely everything. And people are observant, but in the main the precautions taken were correct and served their purpose. Some of the team members got into the game with unprecedented enthusiasm and chose the most extravagant styles of clothing. Personally, I enjoyed the freedom of wearing my favorite suit, but Rogge's bowler hat amused everyone without exception. When one of us made a comment on it, he invariably replied, "Observe the average sailing captain. He always wears a bowler hat." But we're not on a sailing ship. No, the theory remains the same. I mean, the headgear theory. The margins of the bowler offer little or no wind resistance. It's streamlined and won't fly off your head if you have to run away. We were due to sail against England, and many of us felt that we had lingered at anchor too long. It was not until December 28 that we finally left Bremen, having received orders to proceed to Kiel to finish our work. There we were to get food and ammunition for the coming fighting. Dark night, a sudden jolt, a slight rocking and sudden silence. The engines were silent, and then the loud curses of 19 humiliated officers. The damned ship had run aground. Atlantis, a future raider, auxiliary cruiser, barely waiting to go to the open sea, shamefully bogged down in the muddy bottom sediments of the Weser. I do not think it is necessary to quote the statements that accompanied this action. It was not Rog's fault. The ship was under the control of a pilot who did not know the new signs of the navigational situation. But regardless of who was responsible for the accident, the following fact could not be disputed. The beginning was hardly the one we had all dreamed of. That's why Atlantis was in a state of despondency. Feller, our bomb expert, tried to lighten the mood. Nothing to worry about at all. It's a good sign. Remember, the Wolf also began its career by grounding, and how much did it accomplish? The analogy was unfortunate, and the bald head of Caymans, our veteran navigator, turned red with anger. "Yes, you cretin," he hissed. And what became of his captain? He was taken out in no time. The grim memory made us feel even more miserable. The two cases were too much alike. Nor was the incident with the Wolf at the mouth of the Elbe the result of a mistake on the part of the commander. Nevertheless, the Admiralty dismissed him, motivating its decision by the fact that the captain of a raider should have not only skill, but also luck. If such a thing was possible in 1914, what could we expect in 1939, when at the head of the Reich stood the Führer, who believed in the stars and fate? The thought of being without a captain gave no one pleasure. Rog was a real man of firm, determined character, and had nothing to do with the general Nazi hysteria ashore. He possessed all the old Prussian virtues, and probably because of his strict religious upbringing, a minimum of the new Prussian vices, a stickler for strict discipline. He never intimidated or threatened anyone. He accepted command of the Atlantis, well aware of the responsibility associated with the post, a concept he had absorbed with his mother's milk. In a very short time we had come to realize that our captain was strict but reasonable, kind and fair, and in return for our good treatment he gave of himself generously, and to the end. We were already his men, and spent 6 very unpleasant hours pondering the undesirability of seeing anyone else in the place. Then the incoming tide released the Atlantis from captivity. But it was not until a week later that we were reassured that the incident had passed without consequence. Raga's star remained in the sky. Stay away from our propellers. It was March 1940. It was the 3rd week of the month, and the day was devilishly cold. The Kiel Canal was covered with ice. The shore remained white with snow. It was the last month of a seemingly endless winter, the prelude to the first spring of war. The world had only 16 days left before the deafening thunder of conflict would break the silence of the strange war, heralding the blood to come. March 22. A mothership showed herself at the mouth of the Elbe. 2 trumpets, gray-painted hull, bow and stern guns, flag on the stern. March 24. At Studerpip is anchored Norwegian dry cargo ship. 1 pipe, green-painted hull, dazzling white superstructure, yellow quarantine flag. April 9. A Russian auxiliary vessel passed Bergen. Sickle and hammer on the superstructure, red star on the lid of the second hold, inscription on the stern underbelly, "Beware of our propellers." We hoped the Royal Navy would take the hint. Only we and the men who sent us knew that the German, the Norwegian, and the Russian were one and the same ship, the raider Atlantis. It was to break the blockade and move north to fulfill its mission, to attack the enemy's maritime communications. In Kiel, we perfected all the details of the masquerade, threw a sheepskin on the old Wolf's back, and hid his sharp teeth under a 3-layer mask. 6 5.9-inch guns, 4 torpedo tubes, cannons, machine guns, and a supply of mines. Such was the armament of our raider, the hardware that the 8,000-ton dry cargo ship had to not only transport, but also to hide properly, and hide so that they could be retrieved and put into working condition in a few seconds. But how to break free? Rog always said that this would be the most serious problem of our campaign, the main headache. The first thing to do was to get to the ocean expanse. There's plenty of room at sea, whether there are airplanes or not, and we'll be able to do a good job. But first, during the passage through the blockade, we should all show what we can do and ensure perfect camouflage. The enemy's powerful forces are concentrated off our coasts. His intelligence work is excellent, and we must count on the fact that he has a great deal of information. Initiation. It was indeed a most difficult problem, because we had to pass through the water space, tightly patrolled by both ships and aircraft of the British, and even at the base we are not hidden from their aerial reconnaissance. In the event of interception in the North Sea on the side of the British will be all the advantages, and we have no chance. Therefore, Rog said, our main weapon must be camouflage. We must surpass the agility of the snake and the courage of the wolf. A sailor in work overalls neatly inscribed the address on a large packing stand. Straightening up, he looked at the result of his work with the satisfaction of a craftsman who knows his work well, and placed an impressive-looking label beside it. I watched him with interest. I think, he said, grinning, it looks authentic enough. What was inside? A heavy machine gun, ready to fire the moment the wooden walls fell. The label reads, perishable. Symbolic, isn't it? Life's a funny play, and I'm not the most inconspicuous part of it. The deck was a false deck, a kind of cover that concealed the 4 5.9-inch guns so that they could not be seen from the air. The hull was double-hulled at this point. In other words, there were walls to protect the same guns from immodest views from the sea. Even from the quay it was impossible to distinguish, without straining the eyesight, the joints of the hinged plates behind which they were concealed, and the system of counterweights made it possible to remove the camouflage in 2 seconds, and in 5 seconds to open fire. Aft in a huge crate labeled industrial equipment stood a 5th heavy gun, and a 6th was disguised as a deck crane. It's amazing, really amazing, how much can be done with a little bit of wire, paint, a lot of imagination and attention to detail. The crane looked no different from a real crane, and the crate bore the name of the consignee and all the other information normally put on when marking a load. Yes, Atlantis sheepskin was of high quality, from the rangefinder disguised as a water tank to the hold where the seaplane was hidden. It would have taken a keen eye, a great deal of imagination, and a very unlucky coincidence for us to notice the observation posts on our masts, which looked quite ordinary masts of a merchant ship against the background of the starry sky. By means of special periscopic instruments, our observers, seated in special cradles, can spot the enemy at a distance of 20 miles. Thus, Atlantis had a significant advantage: the ability to see while remaining invisible. We could spot potential prey or, on the contrary, a hunter keeping behind the horizon line. Excerpts from my diary. January 10. The Golden Fulls has long since been ordered to live, and from now on we are a very respectable mothership anchored in the naval yard at Kiel. To eradicate all remnants of our trading past, we needed a second chimney made of wood and canvas, and some very convincing-looking guns. These homely canvas and wood masterpieces were quite successful in disguising our true identity and to conceal our intention to revert back to our original state of civilian vessel. The cargo crates were in turn heavily camouflaged. At times, even we found it difficult to distinguish reality from fiction. January. Admiral arrived with an inspection. He was quite impressed. He said that he could not distinguish us from a real mothership, not even from 10 meters. Of course, we are pleased, but we are not quite sure that the praise is not exaggerated. It's amazing how heavy naval searchlights on crossbeams can give a ship a military look. January 31. We are given a great honor. Grand Admiral Ritter himself came from Berlin to wish us a successful voyage. He presented us with a splendid edition of directives and orders, decorated to the highest standards. Expensive red leather, gold embossing, all for us. 4 words in a special font. You will never surrender. February 28th. The Commander-in-Chief's farewell on January 31 was clearly premature. We're still here. And it looks like we'll stay here. What have you done for the fatherland? Merce in Kiel. Winter descended on Atlantis as if mocking the crew's efforts and the captain's plans. Rog, who had originally planned to leave in November, when the polar night could be used as an added advantage, was very nervous about the additional delays caused by the natural conditions added to the downtime caused by the authorities. Ice gripped the ship's hull with gaunt, cold fingers. Myriads of stalactites hung from the rigging and superstructure. It lay a glittering blanket on the quay. Rog already hated the sight of the white, monotonous shoreline, the snowdrift-covered wharves, the black and motionless cranes. In the northern sun, everything around him seemed blue-white. The ice burned and blistered the hands of the sailors clearing the gear, and their hoarse voices echoed far above the frozen bay. The easterly winds blew against the motionless ship, bringing snow and grit with them, sweeping the sailors off their feet as they waded through the slushy deck and freezing them to the bone. Things were not going as hoped. The cold froze the torpedo valves, and the ice made it impossible to tow targets, and therefore impossible for training firings. In addition, Rog felt that at times information leaked out, and there were times when the patience of some officers snapped when confronted with the pompousness and smug indifference of shore-based warriors whose main weapon was a pencil. It was imperative, Rog said, that Atlantis get a telephone. I enthusiastically agreed. The nearest booth was quite far from the ship, and if we needed to make an official call, which was several times a day, the raider officer, usually me, had to sprint 200 meters through a snowstorm and join the tail of the line. But when I approached the appropriate clerk, located in a comfortable heated room on the waterfront, and asked to borrow one of their 20 telephones, it felt like the end of the world. Impossible. It's absolutely impossible, he declared indignantly. My phones are needed for very important work. But the one I'm talking about is in the basement. I protested. Where, as far as I know, is the central boiler room. Isn't it? All telephones, he replied, puffed up with self-importance, are my responsibility. You'll have to look somewhere else, Lieutenant. I did. Our complaints to the Admiralty caused my fat acquaintance the most serious shock of his life. He got a phone call from Berlin itself, and we got the telephone. During the 6 weeks of our stay in Kiel, I received 285 top-secret documents for study, review, or reply. The paper war was waged with great enthusiasm. The disguises necessary for our breakthrough through the blockade were prepared many weeks in advance. We hoped that Goldenfulls had already been finally buried, but there was a possibility of passing the routine report of enemy intelligence on the departure of the mothership from Kiel, and putting 2 and 2 together is not difficult at all. So we decided to organize a double bluff. First, Atlantis will appear as a mothership in different parts of the coast, and then appear north of Cuxhaven in the guise of a Norwegian dry cargo ship. But even while waiting for the last order to leave, information will be transmitted from it to Kiel using the code signals of the mothership, thus requesting tugboats or dock facilities for repairs, informing about the passage of the channel on such and such date at such and such time, and conducting such negotiations. We had the purpose not only to convince the British that the mothership would definitely return, but also try to protect ourselves from unlikely but not impossible leakage of information from our own naval authorities. Counting in advance on the success of such manipulations, we were still aware of the danger that the weather might force us to spend several days away from the coast, and then the British might be interested in the strange Norwegian ship and its reappearance in the north. What is to be done? And what should be our final disguise at the decisive moment of passing the blockade? Rogi's decision to use the Russian flag shocked us with its insolence. The Russians, he explained, had always been a most secretive people, tending to send their ships wherever they wished without prior notice, and hence difficulties were often encountered in identifying them. The commander also took into account certain frictions that existed between England and the Soviets, which made it unlikely that the commander of a British warship would risk taking too severe measures to stop a Russian vessel on the basis of mere vague suspicions. There were other advantages, Rog added. Soviet ports are spared from prying eyes, so the British are unlikely to be able to quickly establish where the original is, and the language barrier has not cancelled. I wonder, grinned Rog, how many Englishmen could not overcome it. Having understood the plans of the commander, we warmly approved his intentions, but the authorization of Berlin was given with great reluctance. At this time on Wilhelmstrasse tried not to annoy the Russians, and having asked for a Soviet naval flag, Rog received it only on condition that the transfer would be made in conditions of absolute secrecy. The flag, wrapped in a large amount of packing paper and carefully tied, would be sent to the Chief of Staff of the Baltic Fleet Command, Admiral, who would hand the parcel to Rog personally. Such precautions suited the commander of the Atlantis, who also, though not for political reasons, wished to avoid publicity. When the long-awaited parcel finally arrived, with great delay, it had gone through the ship's regular mail and had been opened on the way. The fact is that, making such a complex plan of transfer, military intelligence missed one small detail, forgot to warn the Chief of Staff. He later satisfied Rog's curiosity. The Russian flag. Yes, it came in a package addressed to me, so of course I opened it. It seemed unimportant to me, so I forwarded it to the post office for delivery. By the way, why do you collect flags? Back on the ship, Rog was amused when he noticed the young officers trying desperately to manage their curiosity and not ask questions. He decided to keep them in suspense a little longer, extra practice in the art of disguise. The time had come, however, when he could no longer use the usual terse phrases. Well, gentlemen, he said, we can't conduct training firings on the ice-covered Baltic. Therefore, we will have to conduct them in the North Sea. The North Sea. There was a long pause. The thought process had intensified so abruptly that it seemed the movement of thoughts could be heard. The North Sea. Is this really going to be firing? Or are we finally going camping? But Rog said nothing more. A few days passed. A rumor spread around the ship. We leave on Monday. What Monday? That's the 13th. Rog grinned. Don't worry, gentlemen. I was authorized to raise anchor on the 12th at 23.55. There were no battle flags flying in the wind, no goodbyes, no smiles, no tears, no kisses, no fuss. The Atlantis Odyssey began with a crawling, slow, exhausting, monotonous movement following the ancient Hesse, a former dreadnought whose youth coincided with that of the Kaiser, now used to clear the way of ice. The new icebreaker performed its new task with great dignity, as if it were a master who had been forced by chance to lead his servant, an insolent upstart. Meanwhile, in Kiel, my father, a naval shore clerk, looked sadly at the pile of letters and parcels stacked in the room next door to his office. In order to keep the date of going to sea a secret, we left a sailor ashore with the special assignment of going to the post office every day and picking up the mail that came to our address. Then he would stack the letters and parcels in a room that no one used. My father, the only parent who knew what was going on, often looked sadly at these evidences of love from those who knew nothing, and later told me that it was one of the most heartbreaking things to watch. After all, people were writing. Their loving hearts were suffering and waiting in vain for a reply, not realizing that they were waiting in vain and their loved ones were very far away, on the other side of the world. When Atlantis entered the North Sea, it turned out that the tugs, originally assigned to Tau targets, had been sent to perform the arduous and obviously doomed to the failure task of rescuing the crew of a submarine that had been sunk by a British airplane a few hours earlier. It was a bad start, but it could not be otherwise. The 13th is the 13th. There's definitely something to prejudice after all. The rest was no better, and we were not too surprised when the tug we were eventually allocated was too underpowered to tow the target at the necessary speed against the current. In the end, the results of the firing were much less successful than we had hoped, although we did gain some satisfaction on the last night by being the cause of general alarm on shore. The use of tracer shells, producing a flash over the target, proved so vigorous that the following message was sent to Berlin. A very serious naval engagement has taken place. The British fleet has probably attacked in large forces. By the 19th, all was well again. We still didn't know if our departure was the start of a major battle campaign, or if we would just head back to Kiel. Fears and doubts were dispelled by Raj announcing, "I have received orders to prepare for a breakthrough." The moment we had been waiting for 7 long months had finally arrived, the final prelude for the action to begin. Within an hour, the morale of the crew soared to unprecedented heights, and being on the rise, we set a course for Sturepip, where we were to finally take the guise of a Norwegian ship, which could be easily converted into a Russian one. On Sturepip at this time of the year, it is quiet, calm. There are no people, and therefore no prying eyes. At least we counted on it. March 23. Night came. Cold, moisture-laden air blew over the sea and snow-covered land. People on the shore began to get into warm beds, glad that they did not have to leave home, and the rays of distant searchlights lazily shuffled across the black, low-hanging sky. At that time, very strange events began to take place on the mothership moored at the pier. Cheer up, artists. We work fast and well. On Sturepip at this time of year, it is quiet, peaceful, no people, and therefore no prying eyes. At least, that's what we had hoped for. March 23. Night came, cold, moisture-laden air blew over the sea and snow-covered land. People on the shore began to get into warm beds, glad that they did not have to leave home, and the rays of distant searchlights lazily shuffled across the black, low-hanging sky. At that time, very strange events began to take place on the mothership moored at the pier. Cheer up, artists. Work quickly and efficiently. Paints, brushes, and scaffolding were brought out into the light, and frozen, shivering people began to crawl out of the crew quarters, cursing the weather loudly and cursing the commanders who had assigned them to such a dog's work. Here we need to put another layer. Move it. Hey, you there. Who do you think you are? Rembrandts. We're running out of time. Let's paint quickly and efficiently. All night long, under the dim light of the lanterns, which were covered so as not to attract attention, people painted the hull with hands numbed from cold, dangling in the wind in small cradles, climbing up the masts, putting all the feelings accumulated in their souls into quick brush strokes. The chaos that prevailed around them was seeming. In a few hours, the work would be done. Among these suffering and self-pitying ships, Cinderella's, was a sailor named Hell, and he felt in full accordance with the English meaning of his surname. A true artist, endowed, like all his fellow artists, with excessive sensitivity, he was disgusted by the work he was doing, as well as by the speeches of his comrades. My God, he thought, is this the glory of war, the poetry of battle? For a few moments, Hell fell into romantic reveries of heroic battles and foes dropping dead. He was snapped out of his pleasant reverie by the rough voice of a petty officer yelling in his ear, "Hey, you, move your goddamn ass. Big deal, fucking Michelangelo. You don't have 7 years to contemplate your goddamn paintings." The people around them chuckled. Hell angrily stuck a shaggy, vulgar brush into a huge container of a viscous substance called Philistine paint. His thin, sensitive fingers ached from the cold, and before nightfall they were covered with bloody blisters. There were really no prying eyes on the Sturepip, except, of course, for a British airplane that materialized right above our heads. But even he flew by. The pilots obviously did not pay any attention to us. Perhaps they were only interested in submarines. Then we were lucky. A fog rose from the calm black water, covering us with a gray-green blanket. Under such good cover, we were able to lower the false trumpet, the last detail of the new look, without interference. The skipper of the fishing trawler had to sharply shift the rudder to the stop when a dark, menacing silhouette emerged from the fog. What kind of bird is that? he asked the mate. "What the hell is it doing here?" Then the bow of the trawler slowly turned, and the vessel disappeared into the gloom like a ghostly Flying Dutchman. But this skipper was not the only man in the fishing fleet to notice the fog-shrouded vessel in his path. Not even 5 minutes after his swearing had subsided, when the fog suddenly and very quickly cleared, revealing the Atlantis to all comers. Our ship was caught off guard, like an actor at the premature raising of the curtain. "Strange, very strange," said the fisherman on shore. "Did you see the pipe? The second pipe? What the hell was wrong? And did you notice how big their crew was? People were crowding the deck." The fishermen were puzzled. They wanted, in good faith, to offer their help. But a Navy boat came out and sent them away. Stirpip was such a secluded place at this time of year. We had counted on it for nothing. "Close call," noted one of the sailors aboard the Atlantis. "I wonder what they'll tell us ashore." We soon found out. Our next visitor was a rescue boat from Cuxhaven. But just by the time it arrived, we were already Norwegians, very grim Norwegians, unhappy to find ourselves under arrest. The quarantine flag hung a crumpled rag, but was quite visible, and the escort boat had turned into a policeman. The picture was not unusual, at least for these places during the war. It was quite evident that the Norwegian vessel had been stopped for inspection. The salvage crews agreed that it was carrying timber to England. But where was the two-toed ship in distress that the fishermen were talking about? "Who the hell knows?" they shrugged. When they arrived home, they had to listen to many hints about the very peculiar influence of schnapps and fog on the imagination of individuals. That was the end of it. The rescuers were right, at least about one thing. We did have a forest on board, though not for England. Ours was a forest of fake guns, now disassembled and stowed in the holds, to appear later as additions in various guises as the script required. It was April 1940. It was the first week of the month, and a night of thick fog. The waters of the North Sea were choppy and a piercing icy wind was blowing from the land. It was the beginning of a battle campaign during which we were to cover a distance equal to 4 equatorial lengths. It was the beginning of the longest and most destructive sea raid in the history of warfare at sea. For nearly 2 years we were to know no other home but our ship. For almost 2 years we were to fight the whims of our best friend and worst enemy, the sea. Down below, the radio on full volume was blaring a bravura march, and the deck was silent. Fog shrouded the masts and superstructure. Wet, cold, clammy. Silent men moved like ghosts in a land of shadows. No relatives saw us off. No band played on the pier. No bright lights winked at the shore left behind. The musical accompaniment of the beginning of our journey was the rhythmic noise of the engines, echoed by the hum of distant ships, similarly lonely wanderers. We put to sea on April 1. April Fool's Day. We are challenged. The ship plunged into the hollow between the waves, tense and shuddering like a dog ready to attack. Then it crested, shaking off the water, resembling a dog again, but now after a bath, and bringing a cascade of foam, spray, and small ice flakes to the surface. We had already passed the minefield, and now we were moving through the darkness and fine rain, straining to see into the overcast sky, where every speck could be an enemy plane. Our ears were deafened by the piercing howl of the wind, and our hands were stiff in the icy wind. On the bridge, a mug of hot tea was an unimaginable luxury that made our insides clench in anticipation of the blessed warmth. Despite all the inconveniences, we were extremely excited, energized by the Wagnerian rumble of the sea and wind, and the fury of the raging waves. It all seemed new and unusual after being ashore for so long. There were 3 extremely dangerous sections in our path. The first was a channel leading through a gigantic minefield stretching from the Phrygian Islands to the north. The second was the throat, the narrowest section between Norway and the British Isles, and the third was the Denmark Strait, the entrance to the North Atlantic, the always fog-covered passage between Iceland and the pack ice of Greenland. We would challenge the British because British submarines have a bad habit of waiting in ambush at the channel exit through a minefield. British cruisers dominate the throat, and British aircraft control a vast sea area based in the Shetland Islands. In the first section, we were accompanied by an escort of torpedo boats to cover against a possible attack from the depths, and fighter planes as defenders against a threat from the sky. But what next? We were promised a submarine for close escort and a Do-26 seaplane for reconnaissance in the North Sea. That was the most the Admiralty could do for us. Then, Rogg said, it would be up to us. And of course, luck. Luck shouldn't change us, he added. Some of us are going to sleep soundly on shore tonight. Cayman said sourly, glancing at the boats escorting us, which, having accomplished their mission, turned around and raced toward shore like a bunch of teenagers running home from school. Why are you whimpering? Laughed one of us. We're not going anywhere anyway. And Cayman's, remembering the first hours of our mission and the feeling of inexpressible relief that swept over us when the Atlantis finally reached the open sea, was forced to admit that he was right. After all, this is exactly what we wanted. We knew we were going to have to act on the enemy's maritime trade lines, and we went into it with our eyes open. Because of the many restrictions of secrecy, we could not fully enjoy the pleasures of shore life, and therefore did not suffer too much for their absence. The main sensation of the first hours of the trip was an inexpressible feeling of freedom, which made us forget for a while the regrets of unspoken words of farewell, the bitterness of separation for an indefinite period. Our new life on the ocean began. Painful regrets and bitter thoughts will still return and will torment us with long, sleepless nights, appear in dreams. But on April 1, 1940, we left our yesterday behind. Its echo gradually faded, although still trying to be heard. It was drowned out by our voices, loud enough to shout over the sound of the wind and the noise of the propellers whipping the cold water into white foam as Atlantis moved northward. There she is, exclaimed the signalman. Red 45. On the crest of the wave appeared a round, black, and very formidable mine. The corroded horns sticking out of the water gave it the appearance of some ugly living creature, a creature of the deep sea. On our way to the north, we were to meet many more such unwanted and uninvited guests, but so far it was only the first day of our voyage. And the monster, swaying in a frame of wisps of foam, only 35 meters from the board, was a new, unfamiliar sight. Sailors gathered on board to get a closer look at the monstrosity. "The mine is definitely British," said one of the young sailors. His voice was unusually loud and ringing with excitement and eagerness to impress. "Son," the older sailor remarked, "we don't give a damn about that. She may have been born in the Ruhr and have a swastika on her side, but she'll kill us as easily as a British one on impact." Evening came, and with it excitement of a different kind. I see the masts straight ahead. In the thickening twilight, we could distinguish 3 small craft hurrying toward the Norwegian shore. They were very close together. "Trawlers," said Rogg, "but I don't like them very much." The vessels were soon out of sight, but we continued to hear them, for the radio operator, full of self-importance, reported, "The trawlers are sending messages over the air." What they were sending, we never got to know, because the peaceful fishing trawlers were using the British naval cipher. I wrote in my diary, "Not an easy night." From astern surfaced the submarine escorting us. It bobbed like a giant float, occasionally showing us signs on its sides, winked through a cloud of spray like a skeleton's eye, and spat out puffs of black smoke into the air. Hartmann, who commanded the boat, was extremely displeased and regarded the not very graceful, heavy-moving craft, which he was compelled to escort, with frank dislike. What an unfortunate end to so promising a career. What an unpleasant assignment. The last one before the transition to the position of instructor and commander of the training flotilla in the Baltic. Hartmann frowned more and more, and he was so eager to sink at least a few more ships before he retired from active service. He only needed a few measly tons, which would be enough to get the Knight's Cross. Until Atlantis came along, That coveted award had seemed within reach, and his reputation as a ruthless and highly effective commander in submarine circles was so strong that he was simply bound to end his career with some spectacular success. Hartman gazed longingly at the gray surface of the water around the combat deckhouse. He felt out of place, and so probably did his submarine U-37. They'd been stripped of their free hunting rights, lifted from the familiar depths of the sea, and forced to do who knows what. Maybe he wouldn't be so upset if he felt that the U-37 would be truly effective, if there was a real threat looming over Ship 16. Hartman has long since run out of illusions. If the weather continued to deteriorate, the U-37 would be no more useful than an overgrown whale that had accidentally entered these waters. It was bad, too bad. The storm hit Atlantis as it approached the Goral, the area between the Shetland Islands and Burton. Rog had planned to pass this dangerous area before dawn, but quickly lost hope of keeping his schedule, even in the company of a submarine battling a 10-point storm. So he decided to bid farewell to her defenses and sent the boat under the command of a thoroughly annoyed captain down, scheduling a rendezvous later. When dawn broke, the sea was still rough, but there was not a single cloud in the sky. Rog read the intelligence report. Its contents were not comforting. 3 British cruisers control the throat, 3 auxiliary cruisers operating in the Danish Straits. There is increased activity of enemy aircraft. Well, we haven't run into them yet, Rog remarked. The lookout spotted the enemy first, 2 thin black needles rising from the sea to the west. He hesitated for a few seconds before raising the alarm. It is very difficult to hold binoculars firmly in the midst of excitement, and the fanciful colors of dawn and wind often deceive inflamed eyes. He tried to get a steady position in his precarious cradle on the top of the mast and glanced in the right direction again. No, there was no mistake. "I see the masts," he reported over the phone line connecting his secluded nest to the bridge. Combat schedule. When the alarm sounded, the sailors, very temperamental men, whatever they did, whether joking or swearing, always devoting themselves wholeheartedly to their occupation, immediately ceased to refer to the bastards on shore, and took their places. Without knowing Cash, our artilleryman, one might have thought him an Italian. His reactions to successes and failures were too temperamental. Now this short, wiry, swarthy man squatted near the rangefinder above our heads. His excitement was evident in his fanatically burning eyes. The guns are ready for action. Only a slight twitch of the tip of his long, thin nose and a higher-than-usual voice betrayed the emotion that possessed Filesticker as he went about his duties as communications officer. When the war called him from the classrooms of a rural school, many parents were upset. To think their wonderful school principal would become an ordinary private. But Filesticker felt quite happy, in his off-duty time forming study groups from among the crew. He was a firm believer that the human brain must be constantly working. Clear and sober thinking, quick reactions, without which our service cannot do without, can only be demanded from a person who is constantly improving his educational level, expanding his horizons. No, thought Rog, who outwardly remained perfectly calm. The red light on the leading ship's foremast was definitely not a navigational light. Suddenly, the 2 strangers executed a concerted turn and moved in our direction. Around the taller needle a black spot, a chimney, appeared and began to take shape. Rog had no time to waste and knew it. "Engineer to the bridge," he ordered, and in a few minutes Kilgorn appeared. He was breathing hard. The extra weight was taking its toll, as was the change from the heat of the engine room to the freezing air. "So, Chief, what can you do for us?" Kilgorn's round and cheerful face crinkled as he pictured his thought process. He answered rather quickly, though. 16, 17 knots at the most. "I suppose that's it. The old girl's already behaving better than one might expect. Luck. Pirate luck. Atlantis luck." A double call of the engine telegraph followed, and to our considerable surprise, the masts and trumpets of the strange vessels began to slowly recede, and then disappeared behind the horizon line altogether. And the Atlantis, without being pursued by anyone, continued northward. Lucky break. Tension began to ease. Filesticker, trying to read The Conquest of the Gauls, suddenly felt that the printed word had lost its magic power over him. Mentally, he kept returning to the events of the last hour, which had had a singularly rousing effect upon him. Always considered himself devoid of any emotion, Filesticker suddenly realized that in his soul, safely hidden under an outer shell of dryness and contrived calm, lies romantic. A happy accident. Cash believed that it was, if, of course, they were warships of the British, and if auxiliary cruisers. At the thought of challenging an opponent of equal strength to a battle, the always imperturbable and murderously logical Cash gave way to Cash, the fiery fighter. Well, thought Rog, replaying the events of the last hour over and over in his mind, the danger had been close, but it had been safely avoided. The Atlantis job is to get past the blockades, not to engage in a fight that, even if it ends in victory, will result in swift retribution or a premature return home. We were probably lucky, because although we had assumed that an encounter with unknown vessels would not bode well for us, we still had no idea of the degree of danger we had avoided. A few days before the beginning of the German occupation, the British government had decided to force the Norwegians to accede to the demands of the ore carriers by sending a powerful naval force to mine the channel between the Norwegian mainland and the islands, which is used by vessels engaged in the trade with Germany. We spotted the edge of this compound of warships, consisting of a battleship and 16 destroyers. This is far from being a trifle. To starboard remained the lonely island of Jan Mayen. Soon we were joined again by the submarine U-37. We were now in a low atmospheric pressure zone. There was no wind, and during the short northern day the bright sun made the surface of the sea shine like a mirror. The immensity of the surrounding ocean was further emphasized by the complete stillness of the water surface. Absolute silence reigned everywhere, which was not disturbed even by the cries of birds. The only troublemakers were us, Atlantis, and the U-37, which followed us, whipping the water into clouds of milky white foam. In those days I wrote in my diary. Sent fresh rolls to U-37, had a little chat. Hartmann's ambition to sink ships is typical of a submariner. I wonder if the Atlantis had been sunk by some British submarine, what the valiant submariners would have done with the strange trash left behind. Cheerful summer dresses, baby carriages. The results of the dexterity and ingenuity of our minds on the cold sea surface must have been an impressive spectacle. And the British would certainly be completely bewildered by them. For along with the baby carriages, Rog never told us what they were for, there would have been a naval flag floating among the wreckage, as well as flags with the Norwegian cross, sickle and hammer, and the rising sun. So our journey continued. The days grew shorter and the nights longer. When the northern lights ignited the heavens, none of the crew could remain indifferent to this magical sight. Now the ship became the earth for us, and everything around us began to seem as strange and distant as the stars. We had overcome 2 obstacles out of 3. The minefield and the throat were behind us. There was one more to go, the last one. The Denmark Strait became cotton woolly and numb with fatigue. Our heads hummed, and the clouds of spray and ice flakes flying from the sea whipped our cheeks, clung to our eyelashes, and the heavy eyelids closed of their own accord. Atlantis was tossed from side to side, and the strongest keel rocking was replaced by a side rocking, which was not weaker, and then again followed by keeling. Under the blows of icy water we felt like under fire. The ship was lurching. It shook, bounced, and groaned like a human being. But it wouldn't give up. It was stunned, perhaps demoralized, but it moved forward blindly. It was a state when all feelings had died. Only the will and desire to survive remained. Then the excitement subsided, but the cold was truly hellish. Our breath settled as a haze on the metal parts of the binoculars, and with every breath the painfully cold air rushed into our lungs. Our fur hats, the kind worn by Russian officers, had long since ceased to be a mere item of camouflage. Salty, soaked with moisture from the constant splashing, they protected our ears from frostbite and slightly softened the harshness of the wind, wailing like the moans of the Valkyries. The Atlantis was bad, but it was hell for the submarine. Her war room was covered with a multi-ton layer of ice. A multi-ton layer of ice, no exaggeration here. With such a rampage of the elements, we could only wonder how she survived. Still, the submariners followed orders, and their lookouts were subjected to the cruelest torture as the boat crested another wave, then collapsed into a depression, only to crest the next one again. When the storm subsided, it became clear that our Russian props were pretty worn out. The Red Star, which I had made in the engine room to confer a Soviet naval rank, had broken off and been lost. Our surgeon Rail and his assistant, a very young junior lieutenant Sprung, were busy with broken limbs, lacerations, and frostbite. Yet the weather, which inflicted such cruel damage, kept us from heavier losses. The storm swept away the drifting ice that fringed the strait, driving it closer to the Greenland ice belt. Thus we had a chance to slip through those areas that would normally be covered with ice, and thus we could assume that there were no Englishmen there. By driving the floating ice floes closer to the pack ice, the storm had widened the channel for our passage, and Rog tried to make the most of the situation by steering the Atlantis, only 45 meters from the extremely dangerous, glistening blue-white fields visible to starboard. We said goodbye to the accompanying submarine, this time for good. Before leaving, the submariners gave us a 2-word message: good luck hunting. Now the hardest part was behind us. In my diary, I wrote, "Yesterday we passed a strip of pack ice. The landscape was strange and unusual, reminiscent of the moon, with mountains and craters. And today I saw the Gulf Stream, and I really saw it in the truest sense of the word. Where warm water meets cold water, vapor rises from the ocean, and it seems as if the water is boiling." While the off-watch part of the crew was animatedly discussing this peculiar natural phenomenon, we suddenly realized that the north winds were behind us. The first and most difficult leg of our voyage was over. The next day, we crossed the trade routes of the British in the North Atlantic and saw many British ships to which we were of no interest. One of them passed so close that we were able to view the deck guns in great detail. Our instructions, however, were quite definite. We were not to show ourselves in these waters unless we were to be attacked. Our operational area was 1,000 miles to the south. We passed the North Atlantic and set a course southward. Corsairs and kimonos. I still don't know what kind of vessel it was. At the time we identified it as Scandinavian. But Rog said, even if it had been British and full of military contraband, I couldn't have sunk it. And what sailor could sink a sailing ship these days? The sight of a sailing ship illuminated by the first rays of the rising sun is enchanting and mesmerizing. When a graceful 3-masted bark with snow-white sails fluttering in the wind moves on the rippling sea, it seems that a refined lady in crinoline arrogantly stands on the dirty sidewalk. Downstairs in the wardroom, we pestered the commander with hints about his personal attachment to the bark, knowing well his love for sails, which he always preferred to steam and diesel engines. I believe that the decision not to touch the sailing vessel was made quite reasonably. The ship was flying the flag of a neutral country, and we were still in close proximity to the North Atlantic, which meant that the order not to fire if no one was attacking us, and not to draw attention to ourselves, was still in force. The lovely vision therefore passed by, left in blissful ignorance of the danger it had avoided. Its tall stem cut through the water like a silver knife, and the weave of the tackle seemed like a glittering web woven by some unknown spider. Though fragile, the sailboat was strong and seemed a perfect creation of nature, not of man. At this time, we were already passing through the purple waters of the Sargasso Sea, and the Atlantis had taken off its masquerade costume. The Soviet flag and the red star on the hatch cover were gone, and we were now portraying a vessel of a mysterious unknown nation, as mysterious as the Russians. In short, We sailed under a flag depicting the rising sun and were called the Maru. The 8,400-ton vessel carried passengers and had neutral status. The process by which we took on the guise of this vessel was quite complex. First, I selected from the Lloyd's Register all the ships built after 1927 that had a cruising stern, which was the most important thing. The list was very long. I remember I was always shivering when I looked at it. After long, boring and laborious work, I determined that only 26 vessels bore sufficient resemblance to us, but even this list had to be shortened. We should have excluded all vessels well known to the officers of British auxiliary cruisers, and as the latter were most often of the R and O line, we should have excluded all vessels visiting South African and Belgian ports in Africa. But even after this, my work was not finished. Other considerations had to be taken into account. For example, we could not use a ship that had a white waterline because it was very difficult to paint over. In time, I was left with very little choice, and after much discussion, we approved the Maru, generally because it was the only suitable Japanese vessel. Before the fighting began, the days filled with sheer delight. Across the piercing blue sky, where the bright sun never ceased to shine, floated a fantastic procession of whimsical white clouds. They followed majestically and unhurriedly, these cloud caravels, looking down on everything going on below, while the light shadows they cast flickered and were lost in the sea. The sea was so bright blue it was painful to look at. It was adorned with milky white streaks of fluffy foam that crowned the crests of the waves. At times in the water you could see stars of jellyfish shimmering with many colors. Sometimes above the surface showed the gray shiny backs of dolphins performing their complex acrobatic numbers. After the harshness of the north, the warm breeze seemed especially pleasant, gently caressing frostbitten skin, infusing life into tired muscles, and inspiring people to new achievements. Without any reminders, the team worked hard and with full dedication. The sea and sky were clearly conspiring to show us the beauty of the tropics without the debilitating heat and maddening humidity we encountered later. Night was dressing the world around us in a different garb, no less beautiful. Luminous fish flashed on the moonlit surface of the water, painting the waves in a myriad of bright colors. The water shimmered with the most unusual colors, and it seemed as if we were in a wonderful magical fairy tale. The world around us was beautiful, and I still sometimes remember the feeling of complete peace that accompanied us in those days, preceding the long months of nervous tension and the horrors of bloodshed. No, it would be wrong to say that we spent our days in idleness. Taking on the guise of a Japanese required a lot of work, far beyond my study of the Lloyd's Register. The biggest problem was the waterline. No self-respecting vessel would allow herself to be seen on the ocean lanes with a worn and rusted iron belt where a neatly drawn line and cargo mark should be. So our second mate, Ken, became responsible for the presence of the waterline. The operation of waterline marking, which later became for him one of his worst nightmares, was performed at sea with the ship on an artificial roll. 100 men were involved, climbing onto scaffolding and beams tied to the side of the Atlantis with mandala ropes, while a select few were trying to accomplish the unenviable task of applying paint to the stern overhang from a rubber dinghy, jumping up and down 3 meters between strokes. At this time, armed sentries stood on deck and scrutinized the surface of the sea, fearing sharks, and the forward lookout with the sharpest eyesight looked out for uninvited human visitors. And which of them was to be feared more? It was still a big question. Usually immediately after the work was finished, the excitement increased and fresh paint was washed away, so the whole process had to be repeated again. In short, it was not the most pleasant of jobs. The sailors swore and complained, the officers yelled, and snapped their voices. In general, everyone was hot. However, our transformation into the Maru passed without the usual irritation and scolding, and perhaps because the striking contrast between the icy atmosphere of the North Atlantic, which surrounded us during the transformation into a Russian ship, and the gentle weather of the tropics reduced the heat of passions. Days and nights succeeded each other, and the Southern Cross, our guiding beacon, grew brighter and brighter. Somewhere the war was rumbling on, but we felt neither excitement nor anxiety. It is not to say that we did not think about the final destination of our journey. It just began to seem to us that the only thing that mattered was the sea and the sky around us, and that we were no longer separated from the coast by 6,000 miles, but by something much more significant, like 3,000 years. The romance of the vast expanse unceremoniously invaded our souls, and we felt ourselves to be the first Argonauts, while disguise, daily training, and everything connected with them seemed no more than tedious formalities, a vulgar intrusion of ugly ordinariness into the world of the sublime. I see the masts. It was Ellerman's liner, the City of Exeter, sailing from the South Seas to England. It's loaded with passengers, crew. Would it be our first target? We all thought so. The distance between the ships gradually decreased. The gunner reported the distance, corrections for range and altitude. On the bridge reigned tense anticipation. All eyes were fixed on the captain. Finally, Rog lowered the binoculars and dryly said, "There will be no attack." But why? We looked at each other perplexed, then stared at Rog again. "No," he repeated, "we will not attack." He explained that at an early stage he did not want to burden himself with prisoners, of whom there would be many, perhaps more than 100, on such a ship, some of whom might well require special care, perhaps a diet, which we could not provide under existing conditions. We ourselves were content with only the bare necessities. But even if we set aside considerations of humanity, he added, recalling that women and children might be killed in an attack on such a ship, it was too early to draw attention to ourselves. It would be good, I thought, if our disguise didn't arouse the suspicions of the meticulous British. Especially that damned name. Indeed, I had reason to worry about the Japanese letters fore and aft. I had carefully redrawn them from a picture in a magazine, but it was not of the ship, but of an advertising sign on a house in a Japanese town unknown to me. I had no idea what the name Kashimaru looked like when rendered in Japanese characters, and when the work was finished our wit suggested that I had painted on the hull of the vessel a Japanese invitation to visit and enjoy the red light district. A few days earlier we had witnessed the solution of a mystery which had puzzled us much during our preparations in Germany. Rog had ordered baby carriages, and in spite of the general jeering about it, an unlucky staff officer had been instructed to get them. It was only during the dress rehearsal of the play in which we were now acting that it became clear why they were needed. It is a most convincing detail of stage props that is sure to make the audience believe that we have peaceful passengers on board. Now, as the City of Exeter approached us, it became quite obvious. The short, thin assistant cook began to roll the baby carriage slowly back and forth across the deck. He was dressed in a cheerful floral summer dress. We had originally suggested a kimono, but were told that modern Japanese women prefer to dress in Western style. To complete the picture, there was also a proud father on deck, an artilleryman dressed in a civilian suit. What is not a comic opera? A dozen or so of the lowest-ranking crew members strolled lazily aft. Their heads were covered with a German imitation of a tinui, a kind of towel, and the main article of clothing was shirts with the lower ends fluttering in the wind, very much in the Japanese style. I stood by the wheelhouse and smiled charmingly, I'd like to believe it, as I watched the City of Exeter approaching. I wore a luxurious oriental robe over my shoulders and a wide-brimmed straw hat on my head. I wore dark glasses, which I thought made me look sinister, but perhaps the Japanese have different standards. Now I find this burlesque amusing, but at that moment all the participants were serious and focused. The crews stood at the guns, ready to fire at once on the order. If the British had suspected anything, they would have regretted it. We could not allow a warning of a raider to be broadcast, not at this stage of our voyage. From the clean and smart City of Exeter, we were viewed through binoculars. We spotted a few bright glimpses. I was very curious as to what they thought of us there, and I pondered for a while on the luxury and comfort surrounding the British passengers, from which they were distracted for a few moments by our appearance. They must be looking at us now, and feeling curiosity too. What can they be talking about? Look at that, my dear, a real Japanese ship. And those little yellow men on deck are Japanese. On the immaculately clean bridge of the British ship, the officers were crowded together, scrutinizing us. But now they lost interest in us and went about their business, evidently satisfied with what they had seen. Apparently, the officers of the city of Exeter found our appearance so unpresentable that they did not even consider it necessary to greet us politely. But we were not offended. For the first time we had proof that we had not worked in vain. We didn't know then that it would be the message from city of Baghdad a few weeks later that would put us back through the very painful process of taking on a new identity. When developing another camouflage, there are many different things to consider. As Japanese, Atlantis had the image of the rising sun on the gun hatches. But there were some problems. Hatches were in the habit of rusting in places of secret connections and attracted the attention of thick red stripes. This defect, fortunately, was not too noticeable when we met with the city, but later required our constant attention. Such problems, which were the captain's headache, were numerous. He spent hours conferring with Navigator Kamens, a former merchant marine captain, on ways and means of giving the Atlantis the most normal and harmless appearance possible. He would often order a boat to be launched to go around the Atlantis once again. I often accompanied him on these trips. We photographed or sketched parts of the ship so that we could carefully compare them with the original. Rog understood how important every detail was, from the lettering on the false box covering the gun to the height of the pile drivers, and insisted on accuracy in everything. On such trips we observed the action of our deceptive lights, a veritable delight to everyone, as it was very effective. The trick was that at the flick of a switch in the navigator's cabin, we could change the navigation lights. There was a set of alternate ones on both sides, and masts. Thus, we were able to show a red light on the port side, and a green one on the starboard side, a stern light on the mast, and accordingly, following a certain course, to create the appearance of movement in the opposite direction. On the morning of May 3, the tranquil course of our life was interrupted. There was a shout from the lookout. "I see the masts," and in a few minutes we were on our way to the British ship scientist, our first victim, a baptism of blood. Squinting slightly, Kamens watched the approaching British vessel. An old sea wolf, he could never fully understand the attitude of professionals to such cases. He was older than most Atlantis officers and had left a wife ashore. Kamens regarded war as a necessary but terribly unpleasant endeavor and would have been the first to rejoice at its end. He did not approve of the British who had started it, but he reserved his hatred, the real hatred that makes people rush headlong into battle, for the Freemasons and the land sailor, a popular singer in Germany. Whatever disturbing things were happening in the world, Kamens stubbornly repeated, "Again, these Frankmasons, they are the root of all evil." When the loudspeaker announced the voice of Gans Alders, inviting him to enjoy the pleasures of life at sea, Kamens would run out of the wardroom like an angry bull or turn off the radio. Kamens glanced once more at the English vessel. Oh yes, it was indeed English in every line of its construction. The long crossbeams, the long chimney, the old-fashioned stern, and the grim, massive superstructure. The vessel is English in her foresight and English in her classical antiquity. Kamens felt a slight sadness, for it had not been long since the simultaneous entry of English and German vessels into port meant a friendly drinking party. The officer who had administrative duties on the Atlantis looked at the approaching vessel with much less nostalgia. A serious man, a member of the party, he had been very surprised when the war had brought him into the Navy. But he was sincerely devoted to the Führer and eager to serve him. Even during bouts of seasickness, of which there were many, he retained a sense of pride in his belonging to the great party. He could not lower his binoculars. The excitement interfered. And for the umpteenth time, he studied every detail of the enemy ship. Most often his gaze stopped on the red spot on the stern flagstaff. It was a testimony of origin, a symbol of service to country, a flag whose presence in the ocean the Führer wished to get rid of. So that was the beginning. We'd been preparing for it for months on shore. Our war was beginning. Before the alarm had even sounded, we were already standing at the guns, and even the most thick-skinned of us felt that with the appearance of the English ship, we were beginning a new life. I remember thinking that a little longer, and we would cross the line separating pretense from real life. For us, the moment of truth was coming. Even today, 15 years later, I vividly remember the sense of relief that replaced the initial excitement of seeing the scientist. The speed of events had slowed dramatically. Their slowness seemed almost mocking the soul demanded immediate action. I looked back. The situation had long been practiced in training. The sequence of actions was based on similar precedents, raider operations during the First World War. In a certain sense, the information was quite sufficient. First, a signal to stop, then a warning shot in front of the enemy vessel's bow, and finally a polite acceptance of surrender. But we still had the feeling that historians had not described in great detail everything that should happen between the moment of the initial detection of the enemy and the arrival on board of the guests. In general, we were ready for some deviations. We allowed that between the prologue and the epilogue something more than described by the historians could happen. Well, we'll see. Let's learn from our own experience. The English saw only two people on our bridge, the captain and me, the officer of the watch, responsible for transmitting the captain's orders and carrying them out. From the bridge of the English ship it was impossible to notice the artilleryman Cash and 3 sailors huddled behind the canvas fence of the rangefinder. Nor was there any indication that on our, one might say, deserted bridge there was a petty officer helmsman, a torpedo officer with his men, a navigator, and a group of signalmen. Here it is, the moment of truth. Now it will become clear whether our training was necessary. Was this how I had envisioned it? A warm summer day, very calm sea, bright sun. If it weren't for the war, it would be a good time to relax and rest. And we were waiting for the distance between us and the enemy to shrink. It turns out that it is very hard to bear the torture of 2-hour waiting, when minutes seem like years and there is no possibility to distract oneself to speed up their running. There was no heartbreaking drama, just 2 ships slowly approaching each other in the open sea. Everything was peaceful, unhurried, and quite predictable. I could mentally see where and in what position the opponents would be when the warning shot rang out. On the dinghy deck our flying staff, dressed in summer dresses, were driving back and forth the baby carriages, which had already fooled the officers of the city of Exeter. Bulla, our pilot, lamenting his temporary unemployment, strolled dejectedly about the same place, clad in a gray flannel suit. The stage was set, the ambush prepared. I listened to the monotonous voices of sailors repeating distances: 8,000 meters, 7,500 meters, 7,400 meters, 7,300 meters. The signalman was already ready to hoist the XL signal flag on the mast. Halt, or I will shoot. He also had a second signal at the ready. Do not use the radio transmitter. It was a good idea to use different flags. The Englishman was approaching. We listened to the voice reporting distances and looked at our watches. I lowered the binoculars and looked questioningly at Rog. He nodded. Our time had come. Fallen Tarnung. Flags flew up the masts. Crane turned into gun number 3, and the structure aft collapsed, revealing the gray menace of another 5.9-inch gun. The battle flag fluttered in the wind. The whole operation took no more than 2 seconds. Like clockwork, said one voice. He'll die of shock, added another. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were in a movie theater watching a movie for the 5th or 6th time. The raising of the signals, the activation of the small gun we had on the foredeck, and the warning shot in front of the enemy's bow, which was a weighty reinforcement of our warning, all took less time than it took me to write these lines. But there was no reaction on the part of the Englishman. This surprised us. At any rate, we had not expected anything of the kind. Senior Sailor Helmel, nicknamed Frog, even in peacetime, was a true radio fanatic. Once in the Atlantis radio room in wartime, he thought he was in heaven. Here he had many opportunities to show his knowledge and ingenuity. He did not confine himself to carefully recording long-awaited messages from home. To him we owe the advent of Radio Atlantis. In the course of his labors, he not only collected sarcastic comments and news concerning the habits and characters of his colleagues, but also perfected a rather intricate jukebox. Now one could listen to one's favorite record for 1 mark, and someone who didn't like it could pay 5 marks to smash it. But such organizational masterpieces as All for the Red Cross were infinitely far from Frog's mind. Now he stood motionless at the receiver, listening to the English ship's wave. The slightest hint of a signal, and the officers on the bridge must be notified. Busy with his work, he did not hear the rumbling of the warning shot. His ears were covered with sensitive earphones, which he pressed to his head with his hands, just to be sure. There was an unexpected buzzing, followed by the squeak of Morse code. QQQ, QQQ, unidentified merchant vessel orders me to stop. Helmel's hand pressed the key lying before him, interrupting the Englishman's cry for help, and at the same time he reported to the bridge. The vessel has gone on the air. Funny, he thought, but a few words from a mere sailor can spur the whole crew to immediate action. Yes, that's what I am. Frog, the soul of any company. The enemy did not respond to our XLS signal because he simply did not read it. For a moment, except for this insubordination, everything seemed quite normal, and the English ship was empty, with only a solitary figure on the bridge. But the very next moment its silhouette began to change rapidly. Before our eyes it was rapidly thinning, becoming smaller and thinner. It was turning. Here it made a turn, and we saw in front of us wisps of white foam bursting out from under its stern. The Englishman was getting away. From a state of astonished stupor, we were roused by the voice of Froggy, who reported that the ship was still transmitting. Feuerlautness, Rog shouted. Cash smiled approvingly, gleaming smooth white teeth, and startling in its suddenness. Our war began. When the onboard salvo sounded, my ears were pierced by a sharp pain, and my soles were off the floor for a moment as the Atlantis shuddered. My nostrils filled with the acrid and very nasty stench of cordite. The gun smoke that filled the bridge hid the target from us for a while. When it cleared away, I saw 4 foamy fountains, for some reason very slowly rising from the sea on all sides of the British vessel. They stood for a little while, acting as columns, before crashing down into the water again, with a rumble through which I could faintly hear Cash's voice exclaiming, "Again, again." The transmission continues. They're beaming into the air. "Poor bastards," someone said sadly. "That's right," someone else muttered. "Quiet," Pigridge shouted. 2 flashes of piercing red appeared on the deck of the English ship. It was enveloped in a cloud of dust black and gray, the kind you get when you beat out a very dirty carpet. Everything that was happening in front of us was completely different from what we saw when we hit a training target. Here was a dust cloud for some reason did not settle, but began to slowly rise into the sky. Our guns were firing. Again, again. This time, before the volley had subsided over the sea, the radio operator reported, "The transmission has stopped." Following the dust came a cloud of pristine white vapor rising from the target's chimney. Against the blue cloudless sky, it formed a strange fantastic picture and floated away. "Cease fire," Rog ordered, and an unreal silence fell upon us. We saw that the British vessel had stopped. Its decks, just deserted, were now alive with people rushing to take their places in the lifeboats. Flames were visible in several places. The next stage of our operations was to send out a boarding party, of which I was a member. I was to set foot on British soil. Behind me in the dinghy was Feller, who, having taken a stable position, leaned over the planking, lifted one of the 15-kilogram boxes of dynamite, and put it in the dinghy. His red beard, which he had lovingly grown, he liked the color of it to harmonize very much with his equally flaming, though not always clean, hair, stuck resolutely forward. I had not noticed it before. It must have been the importance of the moment. Our blaster was at last at work. His job was to set and detonate the charges that would sink the enemy ship. He labored with the enthusiasm of a professor who was just about to demonstrate the proofs of a scientific thesis ridiculed by all but him. Feller had the adventurous streak of a pirate, but his approach to piracy had the inquisitive thirst for research and experimentation of a university professor. An amateur prankster who amused himself in his leisure hours by such antics as injecting quinine into his colleagues' toothpaste tubes, he had a flair for working with breathable explosives, and as a result he was a combination of brilliant professional and reckless adventurer. His monologue, which began as soon as our dinghy departed from Atlantis, dealt exclusively with technical details. He had decided to place the explosives at two strategic points: at the bulkhead separating the engine room from the forward hold, and at the bulkhead between the engine room and the aft hold, as the manual said. But I don't see why we should have to do such a laborious business as transporting the charges through the interior of the ship, he said, and added thoughtfully, perhaps in the future I'll try the outside and lower them from the deck on ropes. Later he did introduce just such a procedure, but at that moment we wanted to be absolutely sure that we were doing it right. Oh yes, we worked exactly by the book. I, for example, had a big Mauser on my belt, a completely unnecessary load, and the other members of the boarding party did not move lightly either. They had hand grenades, guns on their belts, and automatic rifles. It was only after some time had passed that I discarded such impressive armament as totally superfluous, leaving with me only a bulky canvas bag in which to store the ship's magazines, newspapers, and documents. As we moved away from the ship, the Atlantis was downwind of us, and the boats from the scientist, thus acting as a shelter, and I was able to get a good look at our victims. My first impression was one of surprise, of genuine amazement at the sight of so many dark faces. I had never met an Indian before, and had assumed that an English ship must have a purely British crew. There was only one man left on the scientist, who, when I came on board, gave me a cold look and said a feeble but polite hello. We were both somewhat confused. I broke the silence first. Please present your ship's papers. It turned out that the scientist was a Harrison ship. It was carrying a cargo of ore, chrome, red copper, hides, bark for tanning, maize, flour, and jute, and was bound from Durban for Freetown, where a convoy to England was to be assembled. When the formalities were over, Feller took up the charges, and I began to search the captain's cabin, the bridge, and the navigator's cabin in the hope of finding orders, secret documents, ciphers, and mail. This unpleasant work yielded nothing, for the captain of the scientist knew his business well, and had destroyed everything of little interest before our arrival. My booty, therefore, consisted of a few binoculars, signal flags, and a chronometer. We were in a new business, so both Feller and I spent more time than we had bargained for. Even the consciousness of being on board a British vessel under such unusual circumstances made us move more slowly. There was something very strange about walking about the cabins where pictures of wives and girlfriends, mothers and children, hung on the bulkheads. They seemed to reproach us for rummaging through the personal belongings of those who only hours ago were here. But war is war, and the British sailors were lucky. Things could have gone a lot worse. Searching the officers' quarters, I was surprised to see how cramped they were. The scientist was an old ship, and even the captain's quarters were half the size of my personal quarters on the Atlantis. The radio room was also of interest, though of a slightly different sort. Cash took his job responsibly. A direct hit from a shell had turned that room into a pile of rubble, wood, plastic, metal. It was a miracle that the radio operator had survived with only minor injuries. All the rooms of the ship were gradually filled with the pungent odor of burning jute. I went on deck and came upon the body of a dead Hindu sailor. He was lying on his stomach in a pool of blood, the splinters having blown his skull and mangled his flesh. Of course, I had seen corpses before, as I had taken classes in anatomy. But this shapeless heap of broken bones and torn flesh, which 20 minutes earlier had been a healthy, strong man, made an unforgettable impression on me. I had no time for sorrowful reflections. I looked back at the young sailors of the boarding party, who stood behind me in a silent group. Their faces were pale and miserable. Several were barely holding back vomiting. "All right," I said firmly, "that's enough gawking. Let's get to work." To be sure that the scientist would sink, we not only set the charges, but also opened the kinkstones. Back on the Atlantis, we faced another problem directly related to the sinking of enemy vessels. We had to house his crew, provide them with necessities, and take care of the wounded. First of all, we distributed bedding and dishes. Then we enumerated all the prisoners and even conducted a few interrogations. We later abandoned them. The procedure proved to be completely pointless. We were very interested to know how the prisoners would behave. The radio operator of Scientist became Dr. Ryle's first enemy patient. The radio operator's dedication to his work was meaningless. Frog later told me that although the Englishman managed to get on the air, his signal went unnoticed. This disappointment did not diminish his cheerfulness. The radio operator Scientist turned out to be a very cheerful guy. His comrades called him Sunny Jim. Captain Scientist, Windsor, commander of the Order of the British Empire, 4th degree, was very sorry for our pirate happiness. It turned out that when the Atlantis came within sight, he was not on the bridge. He was resting after watch. Despite strict orders to wake him immediately if any vessel was sighted, the captain was called to the bridge when it was too late. At this stage of the war, many merchant seamen laughed at the warnings about the danger of German raiders. For this they could hardly be blamed. So far only the Graf Spee had experienced its good fortune in the matter, but Windsor, a clever and experienced captain, took the failure hard. He sincerely grieved over the loss of the vessel, and was sure that, had he been warned in time, the Scientist would not have fallen into the hands of the enemy. We found that both the officers and sailors from our first victim were good professionals of the good old merchant navy. After placing them in the prisoner quarters, Feller and I were so tired that we no longer had the energy to celebrate our victory. Solving the captive problem took 4 hours. The meeting with the Scientist was very important to us in many ways. In particular, it demonstrated that despite all the flags and shots in front of the foretop, British sailors would still use radio transmitters. The attack procedure should have been revised. After Scientist, we began to apply a kind of shock therapy, made simultaneously several warning shots, but even this did not help. The hand of the Admiralty clutched the merchant fleet tighter and tighter, and as a consequence our measures became stricter. We tried firing directly into the radio room at the same time as announcing our intentions, but this tactic also proved unsuitable. Now all ships were warned of the presence of German raiders and left, barely noticing another ship. After that, we were forced to switch to night tactics, either approaching at dusk and firing at the enemy from a very short distance, while he did not have time to use the radio, or chasing him in the dark and attacking at dawn. If the merchant ship stopped and its transmitter was silent, we would cease firing, but by this time the casualties were often quite heavy. When the Scientist sank, one of the officers on the bridge shouted joyfully, "This is it. I'd like to see all their suckers go to the bottom." Rog shook his head thoughtfully. "I cannot agree with you. Let's treat this as a necessary job. Ships are like people. Each one lives its own life and dies its own death, and I'm sorry to see them go." This philosophy may not have been appreciated by most of the crew, but personally it gave me a lot to think about, and after thinking about it, I felt Rog was right. Ships die in different ways. Some go silently, gracefully, others do not. Some fight for a long time and sink into the abyss to the accompaniment of explosions, the roar of flames, and the gnash of tearing steel. Others turn upside down and disappear underwater like a giant whale. And some, like the scientist, go quietly away, taking their pride with them. Danger off the coast. Silent night, calm sea. A beam of light slipped from the lighthouse. It illuminated the dark water surface for a moment, then, as if fooling around, covered the deck of the tall gray ship with bizarre patches of light and shadow, and then continued its journey across the frozen surface of the water. The seeming innocence of the vessel was but a cloak thrown on for one of the most hectic and dangerous missions of all. The raider Atlantis was heading for shore. "Damn night for a job like this," said a voice from the darkness. I nodded without turning around. Above us, the velvet sky, studded with bright southern stars, spread its dome over us. It lowered gently, merging somewhere in the dark distance with the sea, and only to the north of us the darkness was cut through by the pulsing beam of a lighthouse. There, too, were thick shadows, born neither in the sea nor in the sky. For the first time since leaving the North Atlantic, we were moving in total darkness in close proximity to the shore, but that shore was as foreign and hostile to us as our mission in these calm, warm waters. Atlantis was slowly moving forward, leaving behind a deadly trail of mines, almost 100 of them. Only they brought dissonance to the majestic symphony of silence, rattling on the guide rails and falling into the water with a loud splash, raising fountains of silvery spray. The foamy jet stretching astern of the vessel was cut by a luminous path cast by the moon on the surface of the sea. Down in the mine compartment, Feller glanced impatiently at his watch or at the rails, which shimmered matte in the dim light. Another black steel fish was just on its way. Surrounded by asparagus, the mine looked like some strange sea monster, unknowingly surviving from primitive times. A splash, another. Feller grinned crookedly as he noticed an obscene sentence written in chalk on one of the mines. "You've misspelled the last name Churchill," he thought. "It has 2 L's in it." I didn't much approve of the decision to go about laying mines under the very noses of the British. The sooner we got rid of Feller's toys, the better. I stared tensely at the darkening shore in the distance. Come to think of it, even Feller had no obvious interest in the project. There was something sickeningly impersonal, sinister about the way these things exploded without any warning, whether friend or foe. As far as Feller was concerned, he wasn't interested in an explosion he couldn't control. A light breeze carried to us from the shore the mysterious air of Africa, saturated with the aromas of spices, the thick odors of the forests, the fumes of the swamps. We were so close to the Cape of Good Hope that we could see the headlights of cars driving along the coastal road, pulling the surrounding rocks out of the darkness. It was a remarkably calm night, and seemed idyllically beautiful. But as things stood, most of us had no time for aesthetic enjoyment. We were busy calculating the many dangers that threatened us thanks to Raga's tactic of mining the waters within a mile of the shore. Any one of us would gladly have given up a clear, star-studded sky in favor of low clouds, and would have preferred the still surface of the water to the swell. Everything around us was threatening. It seemed to us that strange, suspicious eyes were watching us from the shore. However, there were enough observers everywhere. Peaceful ships passed by us now and then, whose captains considered us one of them, non-aggressive, calm, hurrying on their commercial affairs. It was with a sense of relief that those of us who were not otherwise engaged took part in putting on a show for the prisoners. The English sailors were quite capable of putting 2 and 2 together, so we intended to turn their insight to our advantage. They would probably have a good idea of what was going on, and in the event of an unforeseen eventuality, such as their release from the prison ship to which we hoped to transfer them, would tell British intelligence all about it. That would be extremely unpleasant. But how could we hide our occupation from intelligent people? I decided to resort to theatrics. Instead of the infamous red herring, I wanted to offer them a Nazi submarine. A submarine created with special sound effects, which would distract the attention of the prisoners from what was happening in reality and give them food for conversation. Everything began with maneuvering. which was supposed to let the observers know that another watercraft had approached the Atlantis. Next, the gangways were lowered. The noise made during this operation is the easiest to identify, and to complete the picture, people started walking up and down the gangways, and a doctor was urgently summoned from the infirmary. We were especially proud of this last stratagem, for the wounded radio operator of the scientist, who was there, would be sure to know about it, and would not fail to tell Captain Windsor, who often visited him. The reader may think that we were in the habit of making a big deal of it, but in fact we were simply playing our part with quality, even in the smallest details. From the bluff played out especially for the prisoners, who, after all, if they had any chance of getting free, it was purely theoretical, we moved on to another stage of the game. Why not go further in the matter of creating an illusion? After all, we could leave certain clues for the British authorities ashore as well. If we were able to spread the rumor that a wolf pack of submarines had appeared in these safe waters, the consequences could be very profitable. So we prepared the proof. First of all, we got a life buoy, on which we wrote U-37, and then partially smeared the inscription. In this way, we wanted to create an impression that this identification sign was attempted to be painted over for reasons of secrecy, but was unsuccessful. We had a lot of fun with this buoy. First, we beat and trampled it. Then we smeared it with engine oil, and finally, having made it look very unattractive, we threw it overboard. At the same time, we were seriously expecting that someone would fish it out and hand it over to British intelligence in Durban. If so, the gentlemen working in intelligence have enough brains to come to the conclusion by deduction, in the best traditions of Baker Street, to which we pushed them. In the area of the Cape of Good Hope appeared German submarines. It is quite likely that they are engaged in mining the coastal waters. Despite such entertainment, we did not regret a minute when all the mines were dropped, and at dawn, Atlantis, by that time, was already far enough from the coast, again headed northeast, taking a course for the Indian Ocean. In my diary I recorded, May 18. At last the mines are done with. I heard on the news transmitted from Cape Town of an explosion in the neighborhood of Cape Agulhas. May 22. Intercepted a radiogram from the Admiral from Colombo, warning all vessels of the presence of a raider disguised as a Japanese vessel. So the sins of our youth came to the surface. What a blow! Had someone on the city of Exeter blabbed to people who could put two and two together. May 23rd. From now on, the Kashimaru is dead. The Atlantis is now a respectable Abaquirk liner flying the flag of the Netherlands. The bright color combination of the Japanese has been replaced by dull brown and dull olive. What a pity. May 25th. What a number. And we were trying to keep it secret. The Ministry of Propaganda gleefully announced that 8 British ships had been lost on mines laid by a German raider in the Agulhas area. In addition, said the ministry, 3 ships were late, and 3 enemy minesweepers had been blown up and sunk. Who says Dr. Goebbels lacks journalistic flair? At this time, news much more important than information about the activities of an individual ship made us all stick to the radios. The blitzkrieg had begun. All of Germany is in line. Just a few days after the episode with the scientist, our tank divisions rushed to the west, sweeping away everything in their path. Atlantis was moving northward toward the Indian Ocean, and our minds and hearts were occupied with events in distant Dunkirk. We were there mentally, looking into its flaming skies. Every communique of the High Command rang with triumphant fanfares, proclaiming a new victory for our arms, that the British had struck it themselves. France was in chaos. Peace would soon come. Every day the situation seemed better than it had been even yesterday. Every newscast informed us of battles won and cities fallen. We were very young and probably foolish, but many regretted the missed opportunity to become famous. True, the most sensible part of the crew was thinking more about how they would reap the sweet fruits of peace. Paris has fallen. This news had traveled throughout the ship's quarters even before Rogge announced it over the radio.